welcome to the Business of Property podcast. I'm Stuart.
And I'm Simon.
We're both property people running our own businesses, and this podcast is just us chatting, as we often do, about anything and everything property. And before we do get into the show, we are seeing numbers increasing in terms of listenership. So we just wanted to say a big thank you to all of those new listeners, as well as the existing ones. And if you are getting any value from the show, please do share it with somebody else. Just click that share button and get the message out there, help us grow the show even further. On to the discussion of today. And Simon, we were talking about the fun stuff of notice period, arrears, rent arrears, and what we do with sitting tenants. And you've actually got a sitting tenant that we talked about in the last episode. You in the fortunate position of being able to get a purchaser for your property within 10 days of getting it onto the market. But you mentioned to me, which I don't think I was aware of before, didn't realise that you had a tenant still in there. So you're going to have to, do what?
That's a good question. So I have mentioned that this is a let property, and we were...
This is just my memory that's failed on that one.
Yep, definitely. I just thought I'd make sure I reinforced that fact. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Like I needed reminding. I've got a bad memory.
Sorry, that wasn't really the purpose of saying that. We made the decision to try and sell it with the tenant in place for several reasons, but mostly that we didn't want to miss the opportunity of people wanting to move out of London and into more open, greener spaces, which fits the property well, and of course the stamp duty holiday, which has helped get, I was going to say the property market moving, but I think actually just releasing from lockdown helped get the property market moving a lot. But I think the stamp duty holiday has helped put a little bit of extra deadline on that process. So,
yeah. And it's the sentiment, it's created positivity. People are thinking, okay, if we're going to move, now's the time to do it. That's the ethos. It's kind of the fear of loss is driving people.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and we wanted to try and capitalize on that this point in time. So we went ahead and put the property on the market. Of course, we couldn't officially serve notice to the tenant anyway. We could, but it would be a 6-month notice. So it probably wouldn't help with the sale process unless we then waited for several months. But we went ahead, put it on the market with tenant in place. We have not served official notice for them. And we have now sold the property, and we have still not served official notice because the purchase process should take 3-ish months. As we mentioned in the last week's episode, it might actually be a bit longer than that. And we've been already warned to expect probably nearer 4 months at least. But that's still a lot less than the 6-month notice period we would have to give. So instead of falling back on sort of the official requirements of a contract, what we're actually doing is talking to our tenant. I know this is a strange idea to many, but...
Scary.
But it can be done. And having open communications can actually work well. And our tenant, as it happens, is trying to buy a property themselves. They've already found a property. They're hoping to complete, I believe, in October, November kind of time frame. So this fits fairly well. And in return for us sort of saying, we're selling the property as well, hence we really would like it if you could move out before it gets sold or before it gets completed. And can you be a bit flexible on sort of not needing the full notice period and things? In return for them saying, yeah, that's not ideal, but it's reasonable. We in turn are saying, you also don't need to give us the official 2 months notice period for leaving when your property your own purchase completes.
So can I just ask, obviously on an AST, is it are you just rolling? Is that on a rolling agreement at the moment?
Yep, they've been there quite a while. It's on a rolling agreement. Yep. There's no fixed terms involved anymore.
And they've got a 2 month notice period.
Yep, that's what's officially in the contract, I believe. And of course, normally us as landlords would have a 2 month notice period as well. But it's been increased due to the effect of COVID to 6 months at the current time for a Section 21 no fault type.
Yeah, that's the a typical time period. I mean, as a tenant, we have an agreement with our current landlord of 3 months, which is too many for a tenant. But we agreed that at the start.
I mean, I don't think it's unusual for the tenant side of the equation to just be 1 month notice, but I think quite often the AST contract specifies 2 months. I've not heard a 3 month one before, so that is quite a long time.
It's a bigger property, so I do understand it from the landlord's perspective, wanting that amount of time. But anyway,
yeah, harder to relet, so they want to try and have a bit more notice so they can do that potentially. So yes, getting back to the story, our tenant has been lovely to talk to, and they understand the situation. They don't want to get in the way or be awkward or anything. And for our part, we've said, when you're ready to move out due to purchasing your own property, that's fine. You don't need to give us lots of notice. We'll be flexible on ending the rental agreement as and when it suits, really. And she has said that if her purchase doesn't go ahead, she's willing to look for alternative rental property instead when we need that, and we'll try and sort of support and help that in any way we can, and on our part to be flexible. And I think just through open communication and trying to be flexible and help each other reach our mutual goals. No, not mutual, separate goals. We can...
well, mutual, that you both potentially would want to leave at shorter notice with greater flexibility. So mutual in that respect, yeah.
Yes, that's true, yes. But yeah, hopefully it will all work out.
Just being kind to you.
Of course, this approach has quite a significant element of risk, in so much as if our tenant decided to change their mind and be awkward later on, they could mess up our purchase process.
It is a good point, because I kind of live by those rules of, where possible, openness and transparency. And the example you're talking about, I think, is a great example of why that would work. I believe more often than not, because you've been open and honest. Tenant feels like they know where they stand, and fortuitously for you, it turns out that they are in a similar situation in terms of actually they're already thinking about leaving. I have to say, and I probably talked about this in one of our earliest episodes, but when I had just finished a property development and we had a tenant, she had signed a contract for either 6 months or a year, but she had signed a contract. I think it was 6 months, and it was always going to be short term. And I said, that I had been honest that we were going to sell the property, and I gave her more than 2 months. So I think the agreement let's just say was 2 months, but because the tenant lived with a child, I kind of thought, if the shoe were on the other foot, I'd like to know what was going on. So 3 months in advance, I said, look, just so you're aware, I am going to sell the property. It was at that stage, it wasn't even on the market, and we hadn't taken any action. I was just being open. I'd gone to see her and just sat down. Well, within sort of 48 hours, I had received from her notification that she was going to move out and she'd found somewhere else to live. But at which point I kind of reminded her that she had said that she had signed an agreement, and that although I'd shared some information with her, that she was still bound to that agreement. But being a hopefully a more understanding landlord and appreciating which we came to an agreement where I did just let her go out of the agreement early. But I think it's just a warning for all landlords, investors, that we've got to be mindful of those things. My lesson there was, yes, be open and transparent, but maybe be a bit more tentative. If I hadn't had things agreed, maybe let's follow more of a notice period and not try and be too.
So yeah, our tenant had sort of very early warning that we were thinking about putting the property on the market. And then, of course, when we actually did decide to put the property on the market, they were aware, because estate agents were visiting and photographers were visiting and things. But they did have much earlier notice than that we were thinking about it. And I think it's from that much earlier notice that they started their own processes of looking for somewhere to buy or thinking about moving on anyway. So, of course, if we put the property on the market and not found a buyer, we would probably still be looking at losing our tenant in the next few months, which, as you said, wouldn't be ideal because we hadn't given official notice. We hadn't really said that they need to leave. But I think that's just part of the risk. We have said that we are thinking about needing them to leave. So they're going to start working along that process and things. And while it may not have been ideal if they'd left much earlier or if they'd left when we didn't have a buyer, or indeed as it currently stands, they're probably going to leave a few months before, well, a couple of months before the sale completes. So it just doesn't line up perfectly, but I think that's just what you have to accept in return for the fact that you can't serve notice officially in the current times and have it fit with a sensible transaction process.
And in my humble opinion, you get to walk down the street and look the world in the eye. You haven't had to be, opaque about what you do. You haven't had to go behind and okay, worst case scenario, you could have had that conversation, and you had the same results as I did, where they say, well, actually, I don't really want to sit around. Well, A, they could have said, I don't want to sit around waiting for you to do stuff. I'm off. Or B, try and get me out, Mr. Pither. Yeah,
great. And I mean, I suppose even if that had been the result, at least we would have known. So if they turned around and said, no way, we're staying, then we would have known, okay, we can't feasibly put this on the market and actually progress with a sale, except to another potential investor who would want to take on the tenant, which for this particular property isn't realistic because of low yield. But thankfully, we have a lovely tenant, and they're willing to work with us and be flexible, and we'll in turn be flexible with them, and hopefully, fingers crossed, touch wood, etc., it will all work out. But there are risks. It is still unknown. We can't be sure, and we don't have a legal backing to actually enforce anything. So we will have to wait and see. But I think open and honest communication is leading the way and will work out.
Yeah. And unfortunately, for every several lovely tenants or handful of tenants, there'll always be one that isn't so lovely, which brings me on to one of my tenants, which is still on the theme of notice periods, because we talked about this previously on a previous podcast. I have a tenant who, let's just say, has paid sporadically, and on some occasions, in fact, on more than one occasion, has paid £5 less than the due rent. Don't ask, don't understand. But needless to say, I've let those go because life's way too short. However, following our discussion a few weeks back about notice periods, we found out that if a tenant is 6 months in arrears, so from our calculations, we just did a total, and that's kind of how I've approached it, is if the tenant had owed greater than 6 months value of rent.
Yes, I think that's the right way to calculate it. Yeah.
Then the notice period could be shorter. So I think that's good for everybody to know, for landlords, investors to know. But the update on this one is that since then, so the tenant had been paying, based on the calculations I've done, they were 2 months and a bit behind. Since then, since that recording, there is now another month that hasn't been paid. And I'm being told that the pay will come towards the end of October. That, combined with the fact that the tenant moved their rent payment date as well by 2 weeks, means that they're always out of kilter. So I thought this was interesting because this is a learning for me. Some of the learnings in property you don't want to get, but you get them anyway. And I've had a lot of those this year. You know, I live by the maxim: if you're not succeeding, you're learning. And I've done a hell of a lot of learning on property this year. But I had a chat with my letting agent on this one because I'd done my numbers on it. Following our conversation, I ran my numbers so that I was crystal clear, and I ran it past the letting agent, and he agreed with what he concurred, as he said. He concurred with what I said. So we were talking about options because the reason, if people remember, the reason I hadn't given this tenant notice was because I thought, given the current rules of the 6 months, that if I serve notice, then actually what impetus is there for a tenant to pay if they are of that type? Let's just say that if they're of the type where they're paying sporadically anyway, and you serve notice, and they go, well, actually, we're getting moved out. I'm just not going to pay. So that I was reticent to do that, and the letting agent said we should serve notice. I said no, let's not do that because we want to be clear, and I think that was now the right decision. Again, hindsight always 2020. However, now that they are greater than 2 months behind, something I didn't know, and unfortunately, the tenant has lost another job. So we're talking about a very, in inverted commas, unlucky tenant. So I'm not going to get into that. But because they're 2 months behind, we can now, and they've requested universal credit, we, as in the letting agent, can now request that payment directly from any payments. So that's kind of made me feel better. And just to be clear, obviously it doesn't make me feel better that someone's losing a job or they have to apply for universal credit. However, given the situation we've been in for the last 6 to 9 months with this particular tenant, I've missed a number of months of rent. And as I'm sure a lot of us agree in property world, we are almost fronting up these payments. So I thought that was a good learning to share on the show for anyone who didn't know.
Yeah. Have you looked at how much that would be? What the level of universal credit rent support is for your area or that area?
I haven't. The letting agent did, and without giving the numbers specifically, we would get about 80%. In fact, I can do the numbers in my head. It is 80%. We'll get 80% of the rent.
That's not too bad, actually.
It's better than nothing, isn't it?
Yeah,
quite literally right. Better than nothing. So,
yes, right.
which is what we've been getting.
How much tenant cooperation do you need to go through that process? So, I mean, I've heard of
zero
doing this process before, but I don't know what's actually involved. So you can just directly contact the council.
Well, I'm going to be completely honest on this one. I haven't done the reading on that. I do like usually to do the reading on it because obviously we are the legal operators and therefore we should know. However, I did review the part about the universal credit and the letting agent said, yeah, that's true. I can now contact. So I'm guessing, well, the fact that the letting agent has contacted the housing or the local council and he's had it confirmed that can happen and that is now actually in train. I'm glad we're talking about this anonymously because I'm not sure how much of this the tenant knows at this point in time, but we are talking generically. So my understanding, without having read any of this, and I'm happy to receive any feedback, but from what the letting agent's done, he's already actioned it. So my understanding is they don't need it if the tenant is greater than 2 months in arrears. And you've obviously got to corroborate that. We can't just go and falsify or just tell someone anecdotally. There needs to be evidence of that.
Do you know how it will be affected by them potentially finding another job?
In what way?
Well, as in, if I remember the history correctly, this tenant had a job, they lost that job for a while, then they found another job, and now I think you just said they've lost that again.
Your memory is so much better than mine. You remember my own stories better than I can remember, but that is true.
I take notes and study them every night. So.
End call.
So that throughout that process, the universal credit will have been sort of an on-off or an off-on-off, now on-again process. So presumably, when there's no universal credit, there would be no rent support. I don't know exactly how this works or quite where the levels and cutoffs are. So this may not be an all or nothing. But do you know if they find a job next week, whether you will have gone through this process for almost nothing and it will be be switched off again and then you have to start again later, or?
Yeah, it's good questions. The short answer is I don't know. I haven't done the research on that. I would assume what you've just said, because of course, if you're not in need of universal credit, it's right and proper that you don't get it, and therefore we wouldn't get the subsidy, if you want to call it that, from the government. However, from my perspective, any potential avenue is better than what we've got at the moment, because all we've got at the moment are just hopes and dreams as opposed to money in the bank. And unfortunately, this is something that's been going on for the best part of a year pre-COVID as well. So the upshot is that although I was going to sell this property at some stage, I may well just put this property up on the market, not because of the issues, actually, because this property, another conversation, but this property is in a personal name, and I'm kind of trying to move on properties in personal name and reduce CGT. So trying to get that out this year as well. But this has kind of expedited that process. I just want to make it clear that I am going to sell the property, but not because of a ropey tenant. To be honest, it's one of those things that.
Now that you're hoping to recoup some rent through universal credit, will you also be issuing a Section 21 to let them know that you are going to want the property back from them? Or are you going to wait and see if the shortfall from universal credit gradually adds up to 6 months so you can use that shorter notice period? Or are you just going to let it roll and stick with what you can get from universal credit plus any tenant top-ups for the time being?
Yeah, our experience says the likelihood of getting topped up and repayment via tenant is, the hopes are slim to zero, and Slim has left the building. So I think that is not going to happen. So I will be putting it on the property. I'm sure the relevant parties aren't listening to this podcast, but I'll probably just take my time, because we are, we're in October at the time of this release, and then how many people are going to be looking. But I might just punt it pre-Christmas. We'll see. To answer your question, I will wait probably a few weeks just to see where we get to with the universal credit process before I serve the Section 21. But as we've talked about at some length on this episode, we're talking about 6 months either way. So it may well be that I just have to put a call into the tenant, just as you have, just to have that conversation and just say, look, just so you're aware, we're going to put this on the market. That's the rationale. But my expectation, and not my hope, my expectation is that will precipitate the sort of non-payment or severely reduced payment should the tenant get another job. But I've now, accepted that, and will plan for that as we have done recently.
Yeah, so it's sort of a wait and see strategy for a little bit, but you've got a couple of options in your back pocket ready to roll.
Yeah.
Based on how that turns out.
Yeah. But as we've talked about on a podcast in the past, I think that the challenge for us is, of course, we all want people to be safe in their homes and et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go back into that again, but I think hopefully people are clear on our values and that we're not trying to kick people out in the streets. But it is a challenge that we can't really get anyone out of a building till March 2021, even when previously we were legally allowed to do so. And if we're on rolling contracts, to bring this right back to the conversation at the start when you were talking about your 2 months, is that really I should be in that situation. I need to check the contract, but this person's had the AST for more than a couple of years. So we should be in a situation where we shouldn't have to wait 6 months, and it should be right and proper. And when I do get on my soapbox about this, and I shared this with the letting agent, my challenge is that unfortunately, because of the circumstances of the tenant, she can no longer afford this property. It's a lovely property. It's I think we've talked about it before, overlooks a park. It's a lovely Victorian period flat. It's a stunning property. Unfortunately, the tenant should just needs to find somewhere else that isn't this property. But
yeah, and in normal times you would give a couple of months notice, and they'd go back out to the rental market and find something that was more appropriate for them,
and reassess what they can pay. Because as a tenant myself, I can say quite clearly, and I've had this conversation with our landlord stroke landlady, don't want to put any
Don't give
feelers
anything
out.
away. Yep.
And the message back was quite clear. And this was at the outset of COVID. Was if I put out there, said, we might have some challenges. Well, the feedback actually was quite clear. Well, if you've got some challenges, you know what the rent is. So I was left in no uncertain terms.
Oh, well.
But in some ways, obviously, I'd have liked a softer response. But in other ways, it's true. If I've decided to live somewhere that is of a certain type, and then should my personal circumstances change, I would take that responsibility and then have to look elsewhere. But anyway, that's a soapbox.
So, hoping not to push the soapbox too much further, but what do you think of reports of an expected tsunami of homelessness thanks to the courts reopening and landlords being horrible and evicting all their tenants?
Well, I imagine it will make you click on a link and pick up a paper. That headline is probably my most succinct response to that. If you wanted me to expand on it more, I'd say, given the administration and bureaucracy involved with that tsunami, I don't see it. I think there clearly will be. It's a bit like the pent-up demand, really, that some people like yourself, like me, I mean, we're two examples. Although you have a positive experience, my example may be a negative one. And there will, of course, be other people that can't afford to live where they're laying. But I can't see the tsunami, not with all of the financial stimulus that's been involved. I do think we are going to experience some turmoil in terms of the financial things, but financial projections and how people can support themselves. But yeah, what are your views?
I think they're very similar to yours, really. Perhaps expanding a little on the practical side of it. The courts haven't suddenly had extra staffing or extra buildings or anything like that. And in actual fact, they've had their capacity reduced because they have to have fewer people in the buildings at a time. They have to have gaps between people and cleaning and things like this. And they're short on staff due to effects of COVID on the other side. So just from a practical point of view, the throughput of the courts is still massively down on what you would expect in normal times. So yes, there may be lots of people in the process, sort of in the queue, waiting for an eviction to be processed or enforced by the courts. That doesn't mean it's going to happen in a short-term tsunami effect, because there just isn't the court capacity. It will happen gradually. These cases are needing extra paperwork now before they can be reviewed by the court again. And then the court has to schedule them in, and then parties respond, and then they actually need to turn up at these hearings and things be heard and decisions made. This all takes time. It's not going to happen rapidly. It's not going to happen in a big wave. It's going to happen gradually. And I saw one report of a non-urgent. So this isn't an eviction. This is something. I think it might have been a overdue rent enforcement or rent review or something. But it was a non-urgent case that had been referred to the courts by a landlord, and it's been scheduled for October 21.
Yeah.
So I mean, obviously more urgent ones are being scheduled faster than that, but it just goes to show the courts are busy. They don't have the capacity. Things are going to take a long time to work out and sort their way through the system.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about admin and bureaucracy. It's just the actual operational elements of being able to do that. It's they're not just going to open up the doors and say, right, we're ready and we've got a lot of empty seats to run it. So that's good news. And I also don't think that tenants and landlords are just the tenants are just going to pack up their bags and go and live on the street. I hope not. And likewise, unless it's the extreme cases, that us as landlords, we're not just going to start kicking people out. I just don't see that that's going to happen. And we don't. Legally, we can't. So
no, indeed. And even when people do leave their properties, most people won't suddenly be homeless. They'll find another property. And yes, it might be a reevaluation, a downgrade, perhaps, so that it's something they can afford again, or where they couldn't afford their previous property. But yeah, they're not going to be homeless, most of them. So yes, it's all a bit exaggerated on all sides and from all angles.
It's a bit clickbaity, but so based on that, let's put it as the title of our show.
That sounds like a perfect idea. Yes.
Homelessness arriving in April 2021.
Yes, tsunami of homelessness expected imminently.
Yeah. Oh, can you imagine?
Oh dear, oh dear. Right, well, on that happy note, it's time for us to finish up today. Do you want to do the honours, Stuart?
Yes, thank you again, everyone, for listening to the show and listening to our chat. Do hope you're enjoying it. If you are, please do leave a rating or review, or both, if you're feeling that way inclined. We'd love for you to do that and for us to get the message out there. And thanks to all of the growing listeners that we've got. And for all of the show notes or anything interesting that we talk about on the show, we will leave notes in the show notes page. And you can also find those on thebusinessproperty.com. Until next time.